welcome to the Weekly Defence Podcast. I am Richard Thomas, and in this special episode, we will discuss the release of the UK MoD's command paper and do our best to answer some of the questions which you, our listeners, might have following the publication of this long-awaited integrated review. And for a special episode in this first section, we are joined by some special guests brought to you in collaboration with Clarion Defence, organisers of DSEI. So welcome to the show, News Editor Ben Vogel, Air Vice Marshal John Stringer, Director of Strategy at UK Strategic Command, and Gary Waterfall, retired Air Vice Marshal in the RAF and ex-Operations Chief of Staff in Permanent Headquarters, now in post as a Senior Military Advisor to DSEI. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me today.
Hi, Rich.
Hi, great to be here.
Pleasure.
So before we move forward, I just want to quickly mention that a little bit later in the show, I'll be joined by our Air Editor Tim Martin for his comments on what the new strategy means for the RAF. Ben, of course, will fill in on the land side, and I might have one or two things to say regarding the naval domain. Now, we are here to talk, of course, about the integrated review and the broader strategic objectives the MoD wants to achieve. But before I hand over to Ben, I wanted to briefly go through some of the highlights from this integrated review, which, of course, was released in two parts on the 16th of March and the 22nd of March. Probably worth noting as well that the command paper followed the Prime Minister's announcement in November 2020 of a £16.4 billion boost in defence expenditure over the next 4 years, with the UK's defence budget rising to 2.2% of GDP, notwithstanding some fairly significant issues in the MoD's procurement plans. The government mission is to build a global Britain in a competitive age. This is indeed the title of the command paper, by building a digital backbone for the UK armed forces. What this means is that the government aims to invest in integration systems, artificial intelligence, unmanned systems and cyberspace. The review also outlines that investment in cyber will come at a price for conventional defence. The size of the army will shrink. One might argue that this decision comes at a time when the government itself says threats are rising. Some programmes will go ahead, and as we have seen, there have been some cuts in air, land and sea domains. So with all that said, it's time to get some questions asked and some answers brought to us, and let's turn to our guests. Ben, over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard. If I can start by asking you, Johnny, what do you see as the purpose of the integrated review in a nutshell, in a kind of an overarching sense?
No, thanks very much, Ben, and hello, everybody. Well, the clue's in the title, or at least the I. I think we are genuinely bringing together all of the elements of UK national power. We're doing it with a hard-headed, threat-focused look out over the next 10 years. And we're making sure that we are configured across all 5 domains, 3 traditional of air, land and maritime, but importantly, those of cyber and space, so that we join up national power in all of its forms to be best fitted for an era which we know, because we're already in it, that is defined by shifting geostrategic realities and the need to be able to compete both in a conventional sense and increasingly in the area which we would describe as sub-threshold, or perhaps more familiarly as what we call the grey zone. And I think, importantly, the fact that we are taking the broadest possible view of what the UK needs to be able to do and how it needs to be able to respond is what really is one of the defining elements of this review.
Okay, so there is an underlying theme that colours the integrated review that perhaps wasn't the case in previous strategic reviews of defence. Is that fair to say, Gary, from your perspective?
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. I think, I've been in the service for 34 years, and I retired about 18 months ago, and I've lived through, therefore, a fair few defence reviews. And I do think, in agreement with you, Johnny, here, that this one is different. It's a real seminal point for UK defence. And you've seen from both the announcement, the integrated review, but then in the command paper, this is really a real shift, a seismic shift in the way that global Britain is going to present in the world and to the world. And you'll also have heard previously about the MoD's integrated approach laid out from the Chief of Defence Staff, no less, about having this integrated operating concept and the full spectrum capability. Johnny's talked about the sort of below the threshold, the grey zone, and where we find ourselves in this era of pretty much constant competition around the globe. What's changed this time coming out of the integrated review It's a real clear signposting of where and how the ends, ways and the means, frankly, of getting us to 2030. But, and the but here, is it's much broader about the pure military capability. It's talking about harnessing all of the services, all of the domains effectively through the multi-domain integration, all supported, I know we'll come back to it later, in terms of the digital backbone as the essential provider to integrate all of these forces and operate. But it's got a role here, a bigger role than ever before, across UK and international industry because of the rate and the pace of the changes. And it's interesting, you know, I'm now clearly, having left the military, I work for Clarion as the organisers of DSEI, and we step out of the integrated review and the industrial strategy and now look forward to probably the first chance that both the Ministry of Defence has had and industry has had to stand on that stage, unpack what it means, and to really open the doors as to how global Britain is going to present itself both on the stage internally but in the international audience.
Okay, thank you. And just continuing with you, Gary, I mean, Johnny mentioned that the integrated review addresses or tries to address the challenges of hybrid or grey zone warfare. In what other ways does the review in the command paper acknowledge the changing nature of modern warfare and the resulting change in demands upon armed forces procurement?
Yeah, so great question. And, you know, obviously I see the world from where I sit now, being out of the service. I'm a little bit older than Johnny, as I'm sure he'll remind you. So I've seen a little bit more of it. And in my time in the military, I've seen the journey from a single service focus into a joint focus and now into this integrated focus, the multi-domain integration, which is really key. My last job before I retired from the military is where it really came home to me, not only the need to integrate across all the arms of the services and all of the domains we operate in, and from my role in PGHQ, where I was in charge of the planning and execution of global operations, fusing the services together, or so I thought. Very quickly, though, it became apparent to be that it's not just a matter of servicing, bringing the services together, it's about bringing the domains. It doesn't matter whether you're a soldier, whether you're a sailor, or whether you're an airman. Cyber and space permeate through every aspect of your activity, as they do for us sat here today, as they do when we're out on operations. And increasingly, we find ourselves working at this sort of what we would call this sub-threshold. In the old days, when Johnny and I used to go on flying exercises, that was great because we were preparing ourselves for a job that we never thought we would have to do or be forced to do in extremis. Now we realise that actually, rather than that single element of training, we are finding ourselves that every aspect of our training will be heard by our potential adversaries. So we need to make sure that those actions are joint and they're holistic and that they send the message that we need to send to our adversaries out there in the world, either from a de-escalation perspective or from a firm deterrence perspective. And the only way you can do that is not in isolation across their single service arms, but of course doing that collectively. And I think the last point I'd make about the changing nature of modern warfare is the issue of sustainability. Sustainability for somebody in the armed forces, you would think isn't a natural bedfellow, but quite the reverse. If you'd listened to the recent Prime Minister chairing the UN Security Council, I don't think a Prime Minister has chaired the UN Security Council for some 3 decades. And I don't think there's ever been a world leader who's actually chaired it to talk about climate change. I think of the 20 countries right now that are most vulnerable to rising global temperatures, 12 of them are already in conflict. So sustainability is a key here to help the prosperity and help the world be that better place, a more peaceful place, by addressing some of the environmental concerns, which then comes back into the modern warfare, because you can now do it in a way and a place that you probably couldn't have done hitherto because we didn't understand enough and the technology wasn't mature.
So I think one of the fundamentals for defence is we have an evolved, and I would say this, but a really well thought through intellectual framework for how we're going to approach the challenges of the next decade. So I commend the integrated operating concept for a few minutes of people's study, because that really does set out how all 5 domains, working with our allies, working across government, working with the agencies, are going to bring something which we have done in the past. I particularly reflect on my time as Air Component Commander in the Middle East, fighting Daesh, where we've done it well, but we've done it on a rather bespoke and ad hoc basis, and therefore it's been episodic. It's not been our default. It is now going to be our default, and we're already seeing that transition. That in itself reflects the fact we are moving from industrial age warfare to information age warfare. We already heard about the investment in the digital backbone. I'd also highlight what we are going to do in cyber, both defensive and offensive, and also the support and investments into the electromagnetic environment, where, if we're being honest, by dint of some of the fights we've been in over the last 15 years or so, we've probably not given it the emphasis and the focus that traditionally we would have done. And that is important and can get buried in some of the other highlights. And we have a concept really in terms of how we're going to pull this all together. So in terms of multi-domain integration, it's sometimes easy to get lost in interesting doctrinal and conceptual discussions. But I'll give 5 thoughts on what MDI actually means for people. So first off, it's about achieving and then maintaining persistent national strategic advantage, furthering the interests of the UK and its allies, integrating defence, its industry, the partners across government, allies, and our raft of international partners. And worth reflecting that one of the things which is not changing, in fact, is deepening, is the importance, back to Gary's point, of Britain in and to the world. Second element is really getting to the sense of integration by instinct across defence. And that ultimately is going to be about changing culture and behaviour. Very easy to see this is all about equipment. It's far more than that. All of what we would style as our lines of development on organisation, on people, on our thinking, through to our infrastructure, our logistics support, our information systems, all are going to be impacted by this, and that work is already underway. Third is the force structures and the capabilities and how we organise them. We are going to need to sense, to understand, and then orchestrate our effects at a scale and a pace which we've not been able to do before. And therefore, things like artificial intelligence, machine learning, RPA, autonomy are all going to come to the fore. Again, accelerating a trend that we've seen anyway, but vital to embrace and frankly cope with a world where data and information are not only central to our thinking, but are expanding at an exponential rate. That gets you to the 4th point, which, although I won't talk a huge amount about how command and control is going to have to evolve, the fundamentals are to make faster, better decisions that outpace our competitors and our adversaries. And then finally, and you'd expect me to say this, if we're going to be given 45+ billion quid's worth of money, best we spend it as effectively as we can. So the most efficient use of resources, stripping out duplication, thinking of mass and lethality in ways that we have not done before, really the coalescing and cohering of things in the right points, plural, of time and space. Because again, coming back to those 5 domains, we may be dealing with something in, say, one of the 3 traditional domains, maritime, land, air, where we may want to seek effect is, say, in cyber, considerably, thousands of miles away from where actually we are dealing with that challenge in one of the more traditional domains.
I just wanted to sort of pick up a little bit on how the integrated review addresses the well-being of the defence industrial base, because I suppose it stands to reason that without a healthy industrial base that is well aligned with this 5-domain integration priority, then the objectives of the integrated review will arguably fall short. I'm just wondering, Gary, what you think about that?
Yeah, so it's really good, and thanks, Ben. I think, firstly, I'd say arise the SME. Arise the SME, bring your products to the table and show us what you can do quicker, faster than we've done hitherto. Defence is streamlining its procurement process, which is brilliant. Defence and across government are taking a wider shared view of many applications. When you look at space, you look at cyber, there are as many defence and security of the homeland applications as there are in projecting power overseas, perhaps. So I think the role of the SME is going to rise as important. Only yesterday, in fact, in the House of Commons, question from James Gray into Minister for Defence Procurement, Jeremy Quinn, where Jeremy Quinn ended up acknowledging the importance of the UK industry, but was really keen to point out that it isn't just the primes, not the big primes that are satisfying the process that they have done for many years very successfully. This is about, as iterative change bites, getting the small startups, the very innovative, agile companies at their best to maneuver in synchronization with some of the larger primes and have their place. And it's going to help UK prosperity. It's going to give rise, because again, he pointed out companies like Boeing, big US company, and yet they come to UK and they're trying to galvanize the UK SMEs and small elements of the supply chain to increase UK prosperity, increase UK jobs, and harness and build a better product. And again, I'll just turn now to DSEI. What we've seen for the rate of people coming into this year's DSEI for registration is as much about these smaller SMEs wanting to have their place and be heard, which they're going to because they've got the answer. It's like any nutty, wicked problem. It's the small, agile, thinking differently, independent that's going to have the key to the door versus the well-trodden path that we've been on through a long procurement places. I think the MoD, Johnny may be able to comment on this, they're going to publish the SME action plan, which is going to encourage this innovative, this new, this fresh thinking. The role of DASA, what they're doing is great, really getting out and getting this accelerated change.
Yeah, so again, great question. Gary touched on it, of course. There's a lot in the IR. There's a fair amount in the DCP, Defence Command paper, but importantly, of course, what's in the Defence and Security Industrial Strategy released yesterday is really important. It's obviously very germane to your question. The bits I'd probably add to what Gary said and sort of strike me, again, both from a sort of gamekeeper as well as poacher perspective, is the recognition that we absolutely have to reinforce success in terms of where we have genuine world-beating, top-tier technology, and how we pull that through at pace as well. And recognition, as Gary said, and I may have found this form of words for somebody else at DSEI back in 2019, we have to oxygenate, not suffocate, the SMEs here. So I think there's a great opportunity for primes, but that's great opportunities for primes to work with, not to try and assert over. Where I'm sitting now in MoD, we have to play our part in that. So we have to create the framework within which everybody here can prosper as well. And I've already said we've got to inject pace into it as well, because one of the realities of the information age is leaden, decade-plus long procurements are going to be, frankly, if anything, very, very rare exceptions in the future, and probably only for those very, very big, very long-term investments. The third point I'd make is I think it is fascinating the mutually reinforcing benefit the UK should be getting from its investments, particularly in cyber and space, because both are, to a greater or lesser extent, dual use areas for technology.
So clearly there is a plan in place, but I can't really speak to you at this time when the COVID pandemic is still going on without asking you both. And firstly, I'll ask you, Johnny, how much of an impact have unexpected events like COVID affected the evolution of MoD planning to bring these 5 domains, air, land and sea, cyber and space, closer together?
Yeah, well, I think I'm probably more of an ace. That's quite a low bar to pass on Zoom, Skype, Teams and a bunch of other things than I was this time last year. Well, let's take it as the impact on the IR and documents. Do you know what? I think once you take the initial impact, as frankly everybody across government did, let alone society, you then frankly just find your ways of working through. And frankly, would be pretty poor as advocating for being good at supporting national resilience as a Department of State, let alone as the military, if we weren't able to do that. I think what it has done, of course, is it has thrown a really sharp light on some things which had previously run the risk of being in some areas a bit of an abstract discussion or things which other people worried about. Globalisation, interconnectivity, digitalisation, different ways of working, how one combines, co-creates, etc., which is both a very individual way of looking at it, but is absolutely organisational, cross-government stuff as well, which we've had to work our way through. If you look, I think, at the depth of the thinking in the IR, the quality that's gone into it and the deductions that are made, I think you can see that actually the last year or so has not been wasted. And in fact, people have had that time to reflect. They've had time to take what COVID, globalisation, connectivity, whatever you want to sort of draw from it, what that means at a geostrategic and a geopolitical level, and then really reflect it in the IR itself. So I think we've taken a lot of good thinking, a lot of lessons from it, a lot of deductions, and you will see that, well, you've not only seen that in the IR, you will see that play out as to how defence, let alone the rest of government, goes about its business for the next decade.
So I think there's a bit of a step change, and Johnny's always referred to it himself. He's an ace at Zoom and Teams, etc. I think I'm an ace too, but it's been a long journey. But our understanding of harnessing the digital connectivity has increased 2, 3, 4-fold. MoD has continued to maintain the pace on the IR throughout and produce something that's really coherent. One thing we haven't talked about yet, actually, is synthetics. So there is a link here in terms of distributed training, and it comes out in places in the IR. It also comes out very loud and clear in the Air Force's Astra, their plan out to get to 2040, because you talk about through the effect of COVID, how do we maintain the pace of bringing all of these domains together? Well, actually, really clearly here is the benefits of the synthetic. And it's not just about being able to repeat the training, being able to train effectively together in a single environment, being able to be more security aware so that you're not giving away tactics and procedures made to your adversary. But there's also the sustainability aspect from an environmental perspective that we've talked about earlier in this. And Air is on this big march to 90% synthetic training. They need all of the domains to stay in pace with them. Otherwise, one is going to get very good at this in their one isolation, but will still need to go into the live domain to train. The bridge here is back into how we've coped in this world of lockdown from an intellectual and a conceptual perspective. And we need to harness these lessons and roll this into our future thinking. And I've been very heartened when I either work with Clarion or other areas across in my portfolio, how both from an industry perspective, but also from an MoD perspective, it has done nothing but quicken the pace of integration of truly worthwhile synthetic training to be better on the battlefield.
And if I can give, because Gary's given an excellent example with synthetics, another area where we have made more progress in months than we have previously done in years would be telemedicine. But, just the fact that things which defence, wider society felt was, something we maybe sometime in the future, maybe never, we've had to adopt, we've had to embrace, and we've really made a virtue of it. And that has been, just on one part of my own command's portfolio, but what we offer for defence is fundamentally different from where before.
It's interesting how COVID has brought opportunities as well as bringing challenges to the defence industry and the armed forces. So that's a very interesting point. And I'll just move on to the final question. And I know that Johnny and Gary, you've mentioned a little bit how cyber and space are going to fit into this whole concept of multi-domain integration. But I'll just bring to your attention something that was announced by Secretary of State Ben Wallace when he delivered the command paper. He told Parliament how Strategic Command and the RAF will partner to develop a, quote, step change in UK space capabilities by, for instance, delivering a UK-built ISR satellite constellation from 2022. Gary and Johnny, I'm wondering if you could perhaps elaborate a little bit and summarise how cyber and space really will fit in.
So again, Ben, thanks. I'll talk from outside in, really. I'll leave Johnny to talk from the inside out. But, space and cyber, as we talked earlier today, they permeate through everything. They're helping us have this conversation today through every aspect of our lives. It's a whole of defence and security problem, as relevant for you going to the cash point and getting £20 out as it is for delivering military capability. Space, in many ways, is easy because we can see it at night and we can stand next to a satellite and we can watch the satellite constellation be launched, be it for the UK or any of our allies. Cyber's more difficult. It isn't so easy. It's more difficult. Some of it is shrouded behind, rightly, some security aspects. But nevertheless, it's important to put resource into it to get a solution and make us as hard as we can and harden our response. Because we're living with this threat daily. And, as we talked about, the fact that we've got space and all of the assets enables us to have conversations and to have an international timing base. But it's going to sit over every aspect of defence. And Johnny talked about his time as the Air Command Commander. I can talk equally about troops we've got in Somalia or we had in South Sudan, reliant on the services provided by either what Cyber Command are going to deliver or how the Space Command. I'm delighted to see Space Directorate headed up by Harv Smith in the MOD. Even more delighted to see the formation of Space Command that happens to be commanded by an airman, but it's a defence role, not an Air Force role. There is a natural, clear, synergistic link with the Air Force, but we've realised that there's food for all at this table, and there's a need to be thrown across all of the domains, not just concentrated in an area. But okay, Johnny, from your position inside out, you'll definitely have a better view.
Yeah, so the key element here is that that pivot to the information age, whilst already starting to aim off for the fifth industrial beyond, recognises the centrality of information and data. So you have to be invested in cyber, space, and digital. Those are non-negotiables if you're going to shift your approach to persistent engagement, to persistent competition, and the ability to go out and fight and win when you need to. So in terms of space, the investment, first off, is really, really welcome. The vectors and technologies which are likely to be progressed, I'm understandably going to have to be a little bit opaque here. But there are already technology demonstrators as to how we would do communications differently, about how we'd expand sovereign ISR capability from space. And you only have to look at the direction of travel provided by the likes of SpaceX as to how not only vibrant, but also challenging of traditional models and approaches the space domain and the space sector now is. So that fusing together really of both the civil, the defence, into a sort of overall national approach to space is really welcome. And frankly, it's an area where defence, let alone commercial and industrial commentators, should keep us honest and make sure that we really are making good on what we need to be doing in the domain for the nation. Cyber, some areas I can be really transparent. So clearly we are going to want to make sure that not just the front door, but our back door is shut in terms of our networks against intrusions, threats, hacks, ransom attacks, whatever it may be, cyber attacks and ransom demands. And that requires investment in the networks, right through to actually how we operate, how we protect and value our data as a core commodity, such that we can always exploit. We are always assured on the quality of our data. Offensive is where I'm obviously going to be a bit more opaque, but we now have an avowed national cyber force. We have a plan for growth in that over the next few years. It recognises, coming back to what we were saying earlier, the fact we've been able to do some of these things in the past, but we've not been able to necessarily do them at the scale that we would want, and we haven't had the means of integrating them, again, breadth and depth in the past, which now have to and will become our norm.
Thank you very much, Johnny and Gary.
Sorry, just to jump in, Air Vice Marshal Stringer, just to jump in on the point you made there about protecting the front door and the back door. I was speaking with a US-based provider of cybersecurity this week, indeed, and he outlined a very interesting concept to me, something I've not thought of before, in that cyber will have to follow the same protocols that the real-world domains are following now in terms of distributing operations, distributing sensor, distributing attack and defense, so that cyber defense isn't just a central core where all that happens. You have to forward deploy these cyber defense and networks and nodes to catch adversaries closer to, let's say, the point of attack. Is that about right?
I think there's a really interesting macro point, but let me try and sort of take you one head on at the moment. Yes, I think that's right. Any sense of being secure in only one area but insecure in others is probably a bit of a falsehood. Equally, you're going to have to, in terms of how you operate, you're going to have to build not just resilience, but redundancy and alternate ways of operating into your force structures and indeed your experimentation, right through to how your integrated force of the future is actually going to go about its business. So, and the threat surface in cyber is huge. And there's no getting away from that. So at what level actually do you go? Trying to protect all of it is a fool's errand. What must we protect? Where can we afford to be less invested? If I use one of those awful phrases. The macro point, though, is, and the IR recognises this, as does the integrated op concept, that the divisions we previously had at home and away are gone. So you can be affected back in the UK for something that actually has a trigger thousands and thousands of miles away. So that sense of really looking at defence in a totality that we have not had to do in the past is really, really important. Cyber is one of the obvious manifestations of it, but it's not the only one.
I think, Johnny, if I just add that, the other important thing here is this is constantly evolving. This isn't about procuring an aircraft system to see us good for the next 20, 25 years. You know, the threat is changing on a daily basis in a cyber perspective. Therefore, the measures that are in place today to guard, to have an offensive capability probably need to change and adapt on an hour-by-hour, day-by-day basis. So there's going to be a continual evolution of technology stepping forward to keep pace with technology, both from a defensive and an offensive, to continue to make it more difficult for our competitors or potential adversaries to gain an advantage.
Understood. Gentlemen, many thanks for your time. A fascinating conversation there. Thoughts there from Air Vice Marshal John Stringer, Director of Strategy at UK Strategic Command, and Gary Waterfall, retired Air Vice Marshal in the RAF and now Senior Military Advisor to DSEI. Time for a quick break. Coming up next, it's time to dissect the new cuts and capabilities from this week's command paper. Please don't go away.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Lockheed Martin to deliver target sight systems for FMS
smartphones to Australian KC.
Harness expands tactical communications portfolio.
Multi-band terminal production continues with new
5, 15, Block 4 aircraft to receive
Cut through the noise of defense procurement with Shephard's Defense Insight. Save time identifying opportunities, mitigate risk, and get ahead of the competition with the most user-friendly platform in the market. Head over to shepherdmedia.com/demo to request your free demo and see firsthand how accurate integrated program and equipment data at your fingertips can get you ahead of the competition.
And welcome back. As I said earlier, time now to take a look at the command paper from the domain perspective, we've seen, well, cuts across the board. Just a quick skim, and you've got, 70 or 80 Challenger 2's gone, 200 plus Warriors. You've got cuts on the air side. I don't know where to start on there. You've got cuts on Typhoon T1s. You've got cuts on Hawk. You've got cuts on Puma, as far as I can understand, cuts on Chinook. On the sea side, frigates gone. No replacement or no manned replacement for mine countermeasure vessels. Well, I don't know where to start with this, but let's give it a shot. Tim, what do you think from the air side?
Yeah, thanks, Rich. Given that we'd waited with bated breath for this one, I suppose it is a bit of a shame, really, to be talking about cuts in some senses. But it has also to be made clear that not entirely unexpected, and particularly on the air side, a lot of what I wrote in my story anyway, upon the publication, had already been leaked. It's fair to say. I mean, I read through the paper and I thought to myself, actually, that I was trying to tease out, what I didn't already know pretty much, and that it was a difficult exercise. Let's put it like that. So we'll get to some of the details though, and I'll try and frame it in best possible terms. But as we talked about previously, the F-35, I suppose that's the big one. In terms of the commitment, there's no mention of the 138, which there is mention that there'll be more than the 48 on contract, as we discussed last week. It's odd insofar as you would certainly think if the decision was that you're going to continue to meet that SDSR 2015 ambition of 138, then you would just say it right up front. 5 years later, that hasn't happened. So I'll just give you, I think, the Lockheed Martin perspective on that, because I think they deserve kind of a right of reply, perhaps, or that their position is made clear. They said, with aircraft currently contracted through to 2025, there simply was no need for an additional commitment to buy at this stage. We note that contrary to recent speculation, F-35 programme of record has not been cut and remains at 138 through the life of the programme. Today's commitment, and that's referring obviously to the Defence Command paper, will ensure the UK can deliver a credible carrier strike capability. You would obviously that there's a party line to maintain from Lockheed Martin here, but I would just say that in terms of the amount of focus that the figure of 138 has, not just from us, but you can pick any competitor of ours, and the media. I even heard Newsnight were talking about this and all that, and everyone to a person, to a publication, was leaning on the idea that there is effectively a cut here, or there's a downward spiral in terms of the 138 figure. So take, I think, the Lockheed Martin statement with a pinch of salt. I think that is what I would say. And you turn things on its head, and what else come out of the Defence Command paper on air power, and specifically on combat air. Well, there was £2 billion worth of investment for FCAS over 4 years, and so you're left with an impression that actually FCAS is the shiny new toy, and that's the investment is going to be heavily leveraged for the future, compared to F-35. I guess, as we talked about last week, you could frame this as winners and losers between BAE Systems and Lockheed Martin. Beyond that, in terms of the cuts, there's going to be, as you mentioned, the Tranche 1 Eurofighters are going to be retired sooner than we had expected. Perhaps also with the C-130J, that's going to be retired in 2023. Marshall, who's the MRO supplier for that, came out with a statement to say that they were surprised, in effect, that had happened so soon. And then also speaking with a source, he had said that on top of the BAE, the 146s that were announced, and they're going to be retired as well. It was, I think, a week ago, if I'm not mistaken, or around then. You add that to the retirement of the C-130Js, and you've effectively cut the air mobility force by a third. So that's quite extraordinary, really, when you think about it. And also when you consider then you're looking at A, W and C confirmation then that the E7s, originally it was going to be a fleet of 5 being bought. That's been officially confirmed as 3. So that's cut. And then with the Sentry being retired at the end of this year, that effectively means that you have a 2-year gap in A, W and C until the first delivery of the E7s. So yeah, when you begin to add those types of things up, you're a little, I suppose, uncomfortable then about the capabilities, and particularly with the whole idea around, I was going to say spin, but maybe it's unkind to say that, but the Indo-Pacific tilt, and the influence that the UK wants to have, and in terms of power projection and all the rest, it's difficult really to marry those two things together. Although, and suppose on rotary investment and things like that, one bit of good news, I guess, is that there is confirmation that there will be a Puma replacement from 2025. And why that's interesting, or why it's confirmed, is that previously when I had reached out to the MoD for comment, for example, they said that it would be considered, that the replacement would be considered. So I think that was kind of a diplomatic response pre-publication of the Defence Command paper. But they've put it down, in black and white now. So you would think that the likes of Leonardo and Airbus will be competing for that. Certainly, it's kind of been an open secret since at least DSEI 2019, when Leonardo had the AW149 on site at the XL, with a view to pushing for an order with the UK for the Puma replacement. Of course, at that time, there wasn't actually an official requirement. Now there is. So certainly that'll be of interest. But I think by and large, I've made a good stab there of covering the majors, highlights, low points, and everything in between. But certainly in terms of just the major headlines and cuts, investments, things like that, that was a flavour of things from this week.
Yeah, just briefly, in like two lines or less. What's your take? Do you think that the airside was a balanced outcome? Do you think it was a positive outcome? Or do you think overall it's negative?
Yeah, I think because there were so many difficult decisions to make, potentially you were into a situation where, come what may, there was always going to be a certain level of criticism that came with all of this. As I mentioned, and I hope I can be forgiven, particularly on just for kind of going consistently on the frenzy around the F-35. But, that had been, as far back as I think last February, when I started to reach out to defence analysts and talk to this, because of course it was February of this year when the Defence Review was supposed to be published, and previously was also, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was actually October of 2020. Could be wrong on that initially, but having held those conversations, the analysts have said for quite some time that, for example, 70 to 80 would be optimistic. And, you read the things that are coming out of the Public Accounts Committee. And, in terms of the MOD having to get their house in order, there was going to be it was crunch time, effectively, this time around. And so I think also, when you read things like, the very specific language around numbers and things like that, I think there was perhaps a decision made that if you kind of paraphrase things in such a way where it's open to interpretation, then you'll perhaps get off a little lighter in terms of the criticism and things like that. That particularly when you think back to part 1 of the IR, where it was said that we'll order at least 48, and then a week later it was that you would order more than 48. That's exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's exactly the same thing. It does strike me as slightly strange. But yeah, good, bad or otherwise, I think the bright spot is FCAS, certainly from an industrial base perspective. I think we will hear perhaps in the next 2 or 3 years perhaps longer, about flight demonstrations of FCAS. And then you can actually say that, from the first announcement at Farnborough, and with Gavin Williamson, of course, that's genuine progress being made. Because go back to then, and there was absolutely a lot of, there was a sense of the UK going it alone. So it was, how much, from an industrial base perspective, can the UK really drive this forward, particularly with the huge expense of the F-35? And actually, if there is flight demonstrations in the next couple of years, and you're talking about getting laser guided weapons on these things, on Tempest, and you also compare it to what's happening with FCAS, then you have to kind of say that the decision making processes and the progress that's been made has borne success, and you look at what seems to be huge disagreements on the Franco-German FCAS program, and that just leads you to understand that these things aren't easy, and you would have to say that there's no kind of uncomfortable alliances so far with FCAS. It's positive news story, let's say, and 2 billion is not tuppence worth again over 4 years and all the rest of it. But then, the cynic in me will say, well, prove long term that actually these things will be successful, and you don't want the situation then perhaps in the next defence review and things like that you're hearing of things behind the scenes with Tempest that aren't too favourable and things like that. Now, that is speculation on my part, but I'm just saying you wouldn't like to think that those types of things do happen. But as we know with combat air, there is a sense that history does repeat itself, particularly when there's not multinational partners involved.
Yeah, I've actually tried to tempt you to go in hard on their side there and really stick it to them, but you've not. You've actually kept a really balanced outlook there, so thanks for that. That was good. From my side, from the sea side, I tell you what, it's pretty interesting. Obviously has a number of headlines, depends how you want to spin it, but you can look at the 2 frigates being lost, the 2 Type 23s, Monmouth and Montrose. I'm going to get this wrong around. I think Monmouth, I think, was due to go out in 2026, Montrose 2027. That might be the wrong way around, but I think that's right. So they're being binned. Monmouth is effectively, it's been moored up alongside in extended readiness, but it would take an awful lot of money, an awful lot of time for that ship to get ready for sea again, so that's being axed. Montrose, I think, is a loss, because that's doing some really good Sterling work out in the Gulf. That's doing the work with the IMSC and the Maritime Security Patrols. It's forward-based, obviously, there with 2 crews on rotation. That ship's due to be back in 2023. And at that point, they've decided, let's just scrap it, or decommission it, I should say. That the expense, again, to get that ship back up to where it wants to be before it can redeploy, potentially forward again, isn't worth it. And so the savings there are being put back into the 11 remaining Type 23s to keep those trucking on as long as they possibly can while something comes into service, be that Type 26 or a Type 31 first. So that was interesting. What else have we got? We've got, I think, you mentioned there that Gavin Williamson, I think, one of the problems with the MoD, and we could list a lot, is that they rinse through defence secretaries like it's going out of fashion. That every defence secretary comes in and has a really good idea or a bright new thing or a bright new project that they really want to push. And Gavin Williamson is among them, of course. He was pushing the littoral strike ship, I think it was. And those have suddenly gone very, very quiet. What's going to happen with those? These are supposed to be interesting sort of platforms for special forces and Royal Marines to operate from forward-based in areas of interest in the Indo-Pacific and in the Indian Ocean. Now, there was no real mention of those. There was a mention of the Bay-class landing helicopter docks being converted to littoral strike ships. So are you effectively going to get littoral strike ships at the expense of what the Bay-class is? So that's an interesting one. And, of course, the news that the Hunt and Sandown MCMVs are not going to be replaced with a manned platform or a crewed platform, and that the mine countermeasure capability will, of course, will come from unmanned systems, which is fine. They're in development, been in development for a number of years with France, of course. But what are they going to be based from? Now, it's fine having an unmanned system ready to do the jobs that the manned MCMVs are doing, sterling work in the Baltic Sea and in the Gulf. But if you don't have a mothership platform, it's a waste of time. They're just sat in a warehouse somewhere gathering dust or barnacles. So yeah, it seems that it promised so much, and I was so confident that the Royal Navy would come out of it unchanged, or less changed than I feared, or certainly less changed than the other services. And in some respects, that's true, but I think that some of the decisions that appear to have been made are obviously borne by the fact that the money's tight. You know, defence budget might be increased, but is that enough? Is that enough to compensate for the fact that procurement is going through the roof? The cost of procurement is going through the roof. So, yeah, I think in order to stick to the budget that they've done, Defence has decided, well, we're going to have to cut an awful lot from existing programmes and from planned programmes. And the result of that is you've got an armed force which is reduced in every single domain, other than the cyber domain, as we just had a chat before with the two gentlemen from the RAF.
Yeah, and I mean, in some respects, you know, part of this might be, you know, glass half full, glass half empty kind of idea, because, you know, I've heard, or certainly, you know, if you go on social media, you will find ideas or the claim that actually it's the Royal Navy who have benefited most in terms of, if you want to put things in order across our land and sea, well, it's sea who have had the best of it. But as you say, you know, it's perhaps all based on comparisons.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, if I'm to throw in a little bit of balance from my side, and I don't like doing that, but I'll give it a shot. I think what the command paper did, to give it its due, is establish for the air side, for the aviation industry, and for the maritime industry, certainly in terms of the maritime industry, a concrete plan. You know, they will plan a 30-year shipbuilding plan. They're going to be hopefully filling up UK shipyards in terms of building ships, in terms of building subsystems, in terms of maintenance for the next generation. So that's always been the case. That's always been the target, is to implement finally the strategy that Sir John Parker put together in his report in 2017 that the shipbuilding strategy was supposed to implement in 2018, that only now in 2021 are they finally getting around to actually putting in play. And as I say, on the aviation side, it looks like they're trying to secure that capability with Tempest for the next generation. About fair?
Yeah, absolutely. Just on one kind of a little anecdote, let's say, just because you're finishing on Tempest, it was quite interesting yesterday when the Defence Security and Industrial Strategy, DSEI, was released. Jeremy Quinn, who's the Minister of Defence Procurement, of course, was addressing Parliament and effectively launching the document itself. Sorry, that's 23rd of March, I should say. And he was asked about the possibility of FCAS, the Franco-German Spanish, or SCAF, if basically two might become one. So, you know, Tempest would join up with SCAF or vice versa. You know, and is there room effectively for two competing sixth generation, next generation combat air programs in Europe? Bottom line, he said that there's room for two previously, because, of course, Europe for so long had managed three. Now, when he was talking about that, he forgot the name of the Swedish fighter, Gripen, of course.
Oh dear.
Yes. So I thought it was absolutely extraordinary that, like, the word literally just left his head. He just didn't have it. So he named it the Swedish one, which, you know, given that you have a government-to-government partnership between the UK and Sweden on Tempest, and which, you know, is effectively looking and assessing the technologies underpinned by Gripen, it was, I think, a bit of an extraordinary foot in the mouth moment. But yeah, just to kind of to see that in such an important week, it didn't fill you with confidence. Let's just put it like that.
No, I think that's fair, and it's a good example of a number of foot in mouth moments, I think, that we heard over the couple of days of statements and questions and answers in the House of Commons, I should say.
On that note, actually, Ben Wallace, when he was launching the command paper in the House of Commons, he talked about some investment from US Strategic Command in cyber capabilities, and he didn't catch himself in time. So these slips of the tongue seem to be contagious.
Indeed. Ben, on the land side, what have you got for us? What's your take? Because what you've got is hundreds of armoured vehicles being taken from an army that is shrinking through natural wastage down to 72,000 and what is effectively at this point able to perform limited strike. It doesn't have any. It doesn't have the manpower to sustain an operation overseas at this point, does it?
Well, yes. I mean, two things probably worth touching on from the land side in terms of the command paper announcement. And clearly the big one is the decision to terminate the Warrior upgrade. And that was stated in black and white on the command paper. Then not going to upgrade Warrior, but it will remain in service until being replaced by Boxer by the end of the 2020s. And this is obviously a blow to Lockheed Martin UK. Sounds like we're picking on them a bit following the air side, but as recently as February, they were briefing journalists that they were still expecting to sign a manufacturing contract later this year with a view to putting an upgraded Warrior into service by the mid-2020s. And LM UK Chief Executive Peter Ruddock did say, and he still insisted after the announcement of the cancellation of the upgrade, that upgraded Warriors would have provided the British Army with a critical capability. So there is an industrial angle here. Clearly, the cancellation of Warrior upgrade does pose question marks about LM UK's industrial footprint, for instance, their facility in Bedfordshire.
Yeah. Listen, it does both, because this has really got me, this one. What they've done is cut a tactical capability that the British Army needs that isn't being replaced with Boxer. Boxer's an 8x8. Warrior is an armoured fighting vehicle. There's a very big difference between something with a turret on top and a 40mm cannon, or whatever it's supposed to be, compared to a remote weapon system on the top of a Boxer. UK's losing a significant strike capability there. And also, as you mentioned there, it's the Lockheed Martin facility at Amphel. What's that going to do now? That was being built specifically to build turrets for not just for Warrior, but for a future global market worth billions of pounds. That's all pointless at this point.
And the UK talks about maintaining a sovereign defence industrial base. It's very interesting to see how this tallies or aligns with the decision that's been announced. How can that circle be squared? So clearly that's a big issue. And it all happens, this is all going on in the broader context of a cut in overall army numbers as well, which shouldn't be ignored, to about 72,500, I think, is what was announced. And, for all this talk about investment in cyber, AI, space, new technologies, surely there's still a role for boots on the ground. It still needs to be some kind of critical mass in terms of overall numbers. And obviously there's a limit beyond which you cannot cut. How close are we to that limit? Have we even gone beyond it? Who knows? So there is that. And another aspect from the land side, of course, as you mentioned in the intro, Richard, is the decision to upgrade 148 Challenger 2s up to the Challenger 3 standard, spending about 1.3 billion on that. So clearly that's significant. But if you turn that on its head, it still means that 35% of the British Army MBT fleet will be retired. So it still results in a loss of overall numbers in terms of MBTs. Interestingly, last week there was a little bit of talk on social media that Rheinmetall and the UK were going to sign a contract to upgrade Challenger 2. So maybe that's something for us to keep an eye on as and when that's confirmed.
Yeah, indeed. I could talk at length, but I'm pretty sure we've run out of time now, so I will just leave it there. Final thoughts. I just got to say, I think the seaside did okay, not bad. Set for the future. I think the airside, again, similar, not too bad. Bit painful, but setting itself for the future. Landside got an absolute smashing. That was remarkable to see. Anyway, okay. For our listeners, if you want to find out more about Shephard's daily defence news coverage, previous episodes of the podcast, video content, and more, please visit our website, shepherdmedia.com/news. You have been listening to another episode of the Weekly Defence Podcast. A big thanks to everyone who took the time in being with us today, and for our listeners, if you enjoyed the show, make sure you like and subscribe and leave a review on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcast. If you want to know more about the market landscape of the defence sector, visit shepherdmedia.com/subscribe and redeem your free trial to our premium news, where you can get international coverage of equipment innovation, company news, programme updates, and more from our team of expert journalists. Until next week, thanks for listening.